The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was bigger than 10 football fields put together. Ambassador Tejo Kim sat in his chair and looked around at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him. Most of them looked angry or disgusted. He had seen these same looks for months now, but today felt different. Today felt like the end of something important. Tejo had been coming to these meetings for 15 years. He remembered when the other council members used to smile when they saw humans arrive. They used to ask for human help with their problems. They used to say thank you when human ships saved their worlds from disasters. Now they just complained. The Valkyrie representative stood up. His blue skin was darker than usual, which meant he was very angry. Tejo knew this because he had spent years learning about alien body language. Most humans did this. It was part of being good diplomats. But the aliens never bothered to learn human signs. They never cared enough to try. Council member Vexta opened his mouth and sharp teeth gleamed under the lights. He pointed one long finger at Tejo and his voice boomed across the hall. You humans are too violent, he said. Your people solve everything with fighting. You cannot be trusted with important decisions. Tejo felt his hands tighten into fists, but he kept his face calm. He had heard this speech many times before. The same accusations, the same insults, the same complete ignorance of what humans actually did for the galaxy behind. The other council members nodded their agreement. The tall gray Altarians whispered among themselves. The crystalline Zephyrians made clicking sounds of approval. Even the plant-like Verdani rustled their leaves in what Tejo knew was their version of clapping. None of them mentioned the Kepler 7 incident where human marines had died saving Valkyrie children from slavers. None of them talked about the plague on Rigel Prime that human doctors had stopped by working for 3 weeks without sleep. None of them remembered the asteroid that would have destroyed the Altarian homeworld if Captain Sora Park had not flown her ship directly into its path. Tejo looked to his left where Captain Park sat in her dress uniform. Her face was covered in scars from the asteroid mission. She had been in a coma for 2 months after that heroic act. The Altarians had given her a medal and called her a hero, but now they sat silent while Vexta called humans violent monsters. Captain Park had lost her entire crew on that mission. 12 good people had died to save billions of aliens, who now acted like humans were the problem in the galaxy. Tejo watched her face and saw something break inside her eyes. The debate continued. For another hour, Vexta talked about human aggression. The Zephyrian representative complained about human unpredictability, and Altarian council members said humans were too emotional to make good decisions. They talked about humans like they were dangerous animals that needed to be controlled. Not one alien mentioned the human relief ships that brought food to starving worlds. Not one talked about the human engineers who fixed broken space stations for free. Not one remembered the human peacekeepers who had stopped 3 wars in the past decade. Alone Tejo thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was studying to become a doctor and she wanted to help aliens just like her father did. She believed in the dream of different species working together. She thought the galaxy was a place where everyone helped each other, but sitting in this hall listening to these insults, Tejo realized his daughter was wrong. The galaxy did not want partners. They wanted servants. They wanted humans to do the hard, dangerous work and then shut up and disappear when it was time to make decisions. They wanted human blood and human sacrifice, but they did not want human voice. Vexta was still talking. He was explaining why humans should not be allowed to patrol the new trade routes near the Outer Rim. These were the same trade routes that human ships had died protecting just 4 months ago. Captain Park had been there. She had watched good people die in the cold of space while defending alien cargo ships. That was when something snapped. Captain Park stood up slowly. Everyone in the hall turned to look at her. She reached into her uniform jacket and pulled out a small metal object. It was the Star of Valor, the highest military honor the Council could give. She had earned it by saving the Altarian homeworld. She had nearly died for it. The hall became completely silent. Captain Park looked directly at Vexta. Then she looked at each council member one by one. Her scarred face showed no anger, no sadness, just a terrible calm. We are done, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the huge hall. Everyone heard her. Everyone understood what she meant. Captain Park placed the Star of Valor on the table in front of her. The small metal star made a tiny sound when it hit the surface, but in the silence it sounded like thunder. Tejo felt something lift off his shoulders. He had been carrying the weight of 50 years of human service to the galaxy, 50 years of being grateful for the chance to help, 50 years of accepting insults because humans were supposed to be the junior partners, but Captain Park's words had changed everything. Teho reached for his communicator. His hands were completely steady. He had never felt more certain of anything in his life. He pressed the emergency broadcast button and spoke clearly. Execute protocol 7, he said across the galaxy. Every human ship, every human station, every human outpost received the same message. It was a message they had hoped never to hear, but had always been ready for. Protocol 7 meant the end of human participation in galactic affairs. It meant going home. The other council members started to laugh. They thought this was just human drama. They thought humans were acting like children having a tantrum. They had no idea what they had just lost. They could not imagine a galaxy without human help because they had never bothered to notice how much humans actually did. Vextha was still smiling when the first reports started coming in. Human ships were leaving their patrol routes. Human engineers were shutting down their equipment. Human diplomats were packing their offices. The laughter in the council hall died away as the aliens began to realize this was not a joke. Captain Park picked up her medal and put it back in her pocket. She looked at Teho and nodded. Once she had believed in the dream of galactic cooperation. She had been willing to die for aliens who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. Now she was going home. Teho stood up and straightened his diplomatic robes for the last time. He gave the traditional council bow to show respect. Then he turned his back on the greatest deliberative body in the galaxy and walked toward the exit. Captain Park walked beside him. Behind them, the council chamber erupted in confused voices. Aliens were shouting questions, making demands, trying to understand what had just happened. But the two humans did not look back. They had given 50 years of their lives to these people. They had sacrificed everything for the dream of unity. The dream was over. Now it was time to go home. The first alarm bells started ringing exactly 18 hours after the humans left the council chamber. The sound came from the Centauri Mining Consortium headquarters on Alpha Station. Director Zekthor had been sleeping when his emergency communicator screamed to life. He rolled out of his crystal bed and answered the call with one of his 4 arms. Sir, we have a problem, said the voice on the other end. All mining operations have stopped. Zekthor felt his secondary heart skip a beat. The Centauri mines were the biggest source of rare metals in the galaxy. They fed the shipyards that built council vessels. They powered the energy cores that kept 1,000 worlds running. Without those mines, half the galaxy would go dark within months. What do you mean stopped? Zekthor asked. The mining platforms are still working, sir, but nobody knows how to operate them properly. The human engineers left detailed instruction manuals, but sir, the platforms keep having small problems, the kind that need someone to make quick decisions, the kind that need experience. Zekthor understood immediately. The mining platforms were incredibly complex machines. They had thousands of moving parts and millions of sensors. Everything had to work perfectly together. To extract metals from dangerous asteroids, the humans had designed these systems, but more importantly, they had learned to feel when something was wrong. A good human engineer could tell by the sound of an engine that it needed maintenance. They could look at readouts and see patterns that alien eyes missed. They had intuition that came from working with machinery for generations. Now that intuition was gone and the aliens were left with instruction books that could not teach them how to think like humans. Sir, there is more bad news, the voice continued. We tried to contact Earth for technical support, but they are not answering any call. Thor closed all 4 of his eyes. He had voted to restrict human participation in council affairs. He had thought humans were getting too much influence in galactic politics. Now he realized he might have just destroyed his own civilization on the other side of the galaxy. Captain Minsu Lee was packing up the human trading post on Vega Station. He had run this post for 12 years, turning it into the most successful trading hub in 3 sectors. The secret was simple. Minsu understood people. He could make a deal between species that hated each other. He could find common ground where others saw only differences. The station commander, a tall, thin Altarian named Veltar, came running into the trading post. His normally calm blue skin was flushed with panic. Captain Lee, you cannot leave, he said. Who will handle the Korthik traders? They only trust humans. Minsu continued loading his personal items. into storage containers. The Korthik were a difficult species. They were suspicious, paranoid, and quick to anger. But they were also incredibly wealthy, and they controlled some of the most important trade routes in the galaxy. Human traders had spent decades building trust with them, learning their customs, respecting their strange honor codes. Good luck with them, Minsu said without looking up, but Captain Lee Veltar said, you know their language, you understand their customs, they will listen to you. Minsu finally stopped packing and looked at the station commander. They will listen to me because I spent 10 years learning everything about their culture. I went to their homeworld, I ate their food, I learned their songs, I treated them like people instead of problems. Now you want me to stay and fix your mistakes. I am sorry if we offended you, Veltar said. But surely you can see that leaving will hurt everyone, including your own people. Minsu picked up a photo from his desk. It showed him shaking hands with a Korthik clan leader after signing a major trade agreement. Both of them were smiling. The Korthik leader had invited Minsu to his daughter's wedding ceremony, the highest honor their culture could give to an outsider. You never offended me personally, Veltar, Minsu said, but you and your council friends made it very clear that humans are too dangerous to be trusted with important decisions. Well, now you get to make all the decisions yourself. Minsu sealed the last storage container and headed for the door. Behind him he could hear Veltar making frantic calls, trying to find anyone who understood Korthik trading customs, but Minsu knew it was hopeless. The Korthaks did not trust easily, and they never forgot an insult. They would see the human departure as a betrayal, and they would respond by cutting off all trade. Meanwhile, Onzarium Prime Chief Engineer Hyjin Cho was shutting down the planetary defense grid control room. She had worked on this planet for 8 years, maintaining the energy shields that protected 5 billion aliens from deadly solar radiation. The shields were a masterpiece of human engineering, but they needed constant attention. The replacement engineer was a Zephyrian, Crystal, being named Quartzong. He was intelligent and well-trained, but he had only been on the job for 6 months. Hyjin had tried to teach him everything, but there were some things that could not be taught from books. The atmospheric readings are showing some unusual patterns, Quartzong said. Are these normal fluctuations? Hyjin looked at the displays. She could see immediately that one of the northern shield generators was developing a harmonic resonance problem. It was not dangerous yet, but it would become critical within a few days. The fix was simple if you knew what to look for, but the computer systems showed everything as normal. That generator needs a phase adjustment, Hyjin said. You have to manually recalibrate the harmonic dampener. Shao, do you know that? Quartzong asked. All the automatic systems show green light. Hyjin pointed to a seemingly random collection of numbers on the screen. You see how these 3 readings are all prime numbers, and they are appearing in sequence? That pattern only happens when the dampeners are starting to drift. The computer does not recognize it as a problem because technically everything is still within normal parameters, but if you do not fix it, the shield will collapse in 4 days and solar radiation will kill everyone on the northern continent. Hyjin said. Quartzong stared at the screen with growing horror. How many other patterns like this are there? How many things do I not know to look for? Hundreds, Hyjin said. Maybe thousands. I have been working with these systems for years. I can feel when something is wrong, even when the computers say everything is fine, but I will not be here to help you anymore. Why are you doing this? Quartzong asked. Do you not care about the people on this planet? Hyjin felt a flash of anger. Of course I care. I have spent 8 years of my life protecting this world. I have missed my daughter's birthdays, my father's funeral, my own wedding anniversary to keep these shields running, but your council has decided that humans are too dangerous to be trusted. So now you get to protect yourselves. News of the human departure spread across the galaxy like wildfire. At first, many aliens thought it was just a temporary tantrum. They expected the humans to come crawling back within a few days asking for forgiveness, but as hours turned into days and the problems began to mount, the truth became clear. The humans were not coming back on Earth. President Kyung-ho Seo held an emergency meeting with his top advisors. The council had sent dozens of messages begging for talks, offering concessions, promising to reconsider their position, but the president had made his decision. They had 50 years to treat us as equals, he said. They chose to treat us as servants instead. Now they can learn to solve their own problems. What about our people who want to help? Asked his defense secretary. There are many humans who feel guilty about leaving. The president looked out the window at the city below. Millions of humans lived peaceful, happy lives on Earth. They had never asked to be the galaxy's policemen. They had never volunteered to sacrifice their children for alien causes. The galaxy had forced that role on them and then complained when humans became too good at it. Our people are welcome to help, he said, but they will do it as private citizens, not as representatives of Earth. We are done being responsible for everyone else's problems across the galaxy. The first day without human help was ending. It had been a day of small problems and minor inconveniences, but everyone could sense that something fundamental had changed. The steady, reliable presence that had held galactic civilization together for 50 years was gone, and the cracks were already starting to show. 3 weeks had passed since the humans left, and the galaxy was starting to understand what it had lost. The first major disaster struck on Zephyria Prime, a desert world that had been transformed into a paradise by human terraforming technology. Green fields stretched across what had once been endless sand dunes, rivers flowed where there had been nothing but rock. Cities thrived in the shade of forests that humans had grown from nothing. Dr. Hyjin Cho had spent 15 years on Zephyria, teaching the locals how to maintain the atmospheric processors that kept their world livable. She had trained dozens of Zephyrian technicians and left behind detailed manuals covering every aspect of the system, but there were some things that could not be written down in books. The dust storm came without warning. Zephyria had dust storms before, but this one was different. It was bigger than any storm in recorded history. The winds carried particles that clogged the intake filters of the atmospheric processors. Within hours, the machines that kept the air breathable began to struggle. Chief Technician Velnora rushed to the main processing plant with his emergency team. They found the massive machines groaning under the strain. Red warning lights flashed everywhere and alarms blared from every speaker. The instruction manual said to replace the filters, but when they opened the access panels, they found something the manuals had never mentioned. The dust was not just ordinary sand, it was a special type of crystalline particle that formed only during the biggest storms. Dr. Cho had seen this happen twice before, and she had developed a special cleaning procedure that involved reversing the airflow and using harmonic vibrations to break up the crystal formations, but she had never written this procedure down because she had planned to teach it to the technicians in Personville. Nara tried everything he could think of. He followed every procedure in the manual, but nothing worked. The atmospheric processors continued to fail, and the air quality readings dropped hour by hour. Within 2 days, the oxygen levels were dangerously low, and the Zephyrian government declared a planetary emergency. We need to evacuate the children first, said Governor Zex Myra as she watched the readouts from the capital city. But where can we send them? The nearest habitable world is 6 months away by transport ship. Meanwhile, the news reports were reaching Earth. Dr. Cho sat in her small apartment on Europa watching the feeds from her former home. She recognized every building, every street, every face on the screen. These were people she had worked with for 15 years. They were her friends, her colleagues, her students. Her daughter Sujin sat beside her watching the same reports. Mom, she said, why don't you go back and help them? You know how to fix this. Dr. Cho stared at the screen as the camera showed children being loaded onto evacuation ships. Their parents looked terrified because they knew there was nowhere safe to go. The entire Zephyrian population was homeless, and the council had no plan to help them. I tried to teach them everything, Sujin, she said, but they always relied on me to handle the difficult problems. They never bothered to learn the advanced procedures because they thought I would always be there. But people are going to die, Sujin said. Dr. Cho closed her eyes and remembered the last council meeting she had attended. A Zephyrian representative had stood up and said that humans were too emotional to be trusted with important environmental decisions. The same representative had voted to reduce human authority over terraforming projects because aliens could handle their own worlds better. People are dying because their government decided they did not need human help anymore. Dr. Cho said, I spent 15 years trying to prepare them for this day, but they were not interested in learning the hard parts. They only wanted the easy parts. The military situation was even worse. Captain Wu Jin Nam had commanded the human peacekeeping fleet that protected the Silk Road trade corridor. It was the most important shipping route in the galaxy, connecting the industrial core worlds with the resource-rich outer planets. The route passed through dangerous space filled with pirates, raiders, and worse things. Admiral Kexthor of the Altarian Navy had volunteered to take over the peacekeeping mission. He was proud, confident, and completely unprepared for what he would face. The Altarian fleet was beautiful. Their ships were works of art with gleaming hulls and perfect formations. But they had been designed for parades and diplomatic shows, not for real combat. The first pirate attack came on a Tuesday morning. A small fleet of raiders hit a convoy of grain ships carrying food to the famine-stricken worlds of the Outer Rim. The convoy sent out a distress call, and Admiral Kexthor responded with his flagship and 6 escort vessels. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes. The Altarian ships were faster and more advanced than the pirate vessels, but the pirates fought like animals. They used ramming attacks, suicide runs, and dirty tricks that no civilized navy would ever consider. Admiral Kexthor had trained for honorable combat between gentlemen. He had no idea how to fight against enemies who ignored all the rules. 3 Altarian ships were destroyed, and the admiral himself was taken prisoner. The pirates broadcasted his capture across the galaxy, showing the proud Altarian commander begging for his life. The message was clear: the trade routes were no longer protected. Anyone who wanted to travel through space would have to pay tribute to the pirates or take their chances. Alone, Captain Nam watched the broadcast from his retirement home on Mars. He had fought these same pirates dozens of times. He knew their tactics, their weaknesses, their hiding places, but he also remembered the council meeting where an Altarian representative had called human military tactics brutal and uncivilized. The Altarians had wanted civilized warfare with rules and honor codes. They had gotten exactly what they asked for, and now they were learning that pirates did not care about honor. The economic collapse accelerated as the trade routes became unsafe. Insurance companies refused to cover ships traveling through the Silk Road. The cost of transporting goods increased by 500%. Overnight worlds that depended on imported food began to starve. Colonies that exported raw materials found themselves cut off from their markets. On Rigel Prime, the government called an emergency session to discuss the crisis. Governor Melterra had been one of the strongest supporters of limiting human influence in galactic affairs. She had argued that humans were too aggressive, too willing to use force to solve problems. Now she stood before the planetary assembly and tried to explain why there was no food in the stores and no medicine in the hospitals. The situation is temporary, she said. We are negotiating with the pirates to establish reasonable tribute payments for safe passage. A voice from the back of the assembly hall shouted, "What about the humans? Can we ask them to come back?" Governor Melterra shook her head. "The humans have made it clear they are not interested in galactic affairs anymore. We must solve our own problems, but we cannot solve them," said another voice. "We do not know how to fight pirates. We do not know how to maintain the terraforming equipment. We do not know how to negotiate with the difficult species. The humans did all of that for us." Governor Melterra had no answer because she knew it was true. The humans had not conquered the galaxy or forced themselves into positions of power. They had simply made themselves indispensable by being willing to do the jobs that no one else wanted to do. The food riots started that night. By morning, the planetary government had collapsed and Rigel Prime was under martial law. The governor sent one last desperate message to Earth begging for help, but the message was returned with a simple note: we are no longer accepting communications from Council space. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out on hundreds of worlds. The careful balance that had kept galactic civilization stable for 50 years was breaking down. Without human mediators, old enemies began to remember old grudges. Without human engineers, complex systems began to fail. Without human peacekeepers, raiders and pirates grew bold. The Galactic Council called emergency session after emergency session, but they had no solutions to offer. They could debate and argue and point fingers, but they could not fix atmospheric processors or fight pirates or negotiate with hostile aliens. They had spent so long criticizing human methods that they had never bothered to learn how to replace them. The cascade had begun, and there was no way to stop it. The galaxy was learning that taking human help for granted had been the greatest mistake in its history. But the lesson was coming too late. To save the civilization that humans had spent 50 years building, the humans were gone and everything they had built was falling apart. 2 months after the human departure, the true scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Every day brought new reports of system failures, economic collapse, and social unrest. The humans had been involved in everything not because they wanted to control the galaxy, but because they were the only species that seemed to enjoy solving other people's problems. Lieutenant Colonel Unesio Park had been the chief military advisor to the Rimward Defense Coalition, a loose alliance of 12 different alien species that shared borders along the dangerous edge of the galaxy. The coalition had been her greatest achievement. She had spent 8 years learning the languages, cultures, and military traditions of 12 completely different species. The key had been understanding that each species had different strengths. The crystalline Zephyrians were excellent at defensive warfare. The aggressive Korthax made perfect shock troops. The analytical Altarians were brilliant strategists. The plant-like Verdani could survive in environments that would kill other species. Colonel Park had created a military doctrine that used each species for what they did best. She had written training manuals that taught Korthax warriors to work with Zephyrian defenders. She had organized joint exercises that helped different species learn to trust each other. She had mediated hundreds of disputes over tactics, territory, and honor. Most importantly, she had been the one person that all 12 species trusted. She was not trying to advance her own people's interests. She was not playing favorites. She was just trying to make the alliance work for everyone. Now she was gone, and the Rimward Defense Coalition was falling apart. The first crack appeared when the Korthax Third Fleet accused the Zephyrian Home Guard of abandoning them during a pirate raid. The Zephyrians claimed they had followed proper defensive protocols. The Korthax said the Zephyrians were cowards who cared more about protecting their own ships than helping their allies. Without Colonel Park to mediate the dispute, both sides began to believe the worst about each other. The Korthax pulled their ships back to their own territory. The Zephyrians accused them of breaking the alliance. The other 10 species began choosing sides. Old rivalries that had been buried under 50 years of cooperation began to surface. Within 2 weeks, 3 different border wars had started. The Altarian Republic found itself fighting the Verdani Collective over mining rights in the Centauri system. The Korthax declared a blood feud against the Zephyrians and began raiding their colonies. The smaller species formed desperate alliances that shifted every few days as the political situation changed. Colonel Park watched the news feeds from her small house in the Colorado mountains. She had retired there after leaving the military, and she spent her days hiking in the forests and reading books about Earth history, but she could not escape the reports from her former command. Her old aide, Captain Jinwoo Seo, called her on a secure channel. "Colonel," he said, "the situation is getting worse every day. The Altarians are asking if you would consider coming back as a civilian contractor. They are offering enormous sums of money." Colonel Park looked out her window at the peaceful forest. She had spent 30 years in the military, fighting other people's wars, mediating other people's disputes, building other people's peace. Now she was 55 years old and tired. "Tell them no, Jinwoo," she said. "I gave the best years of my life to that alliance. I tried to teach them how to work together, but they were more interested in their own pride than in learning from each other. But Colonel, thousands of people are dying in these wars. You could stop it." Colonel Park was quiet for a long moment. She remembered the last coalition meeting she had attended. The Altarian general had suggested that human military advisors were no longer necessary because the alien species had learned to cooperate on their own. The other representatives had agreed. They had voted to phase out human involvement in coalition affairs. "I could stop it for a few months," she said finally, "but then what they would go back to fighting as soon as I left again. They never learned how to solve their own problems because they always had humans to do it for them." The economic situation was even worse. Engineer Kyung-ho Seo had designed the power distribution system for the Great Dyson Ring around Proxima Centauri. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in galactic history. A ring of solar collectors that captured the energy of an entire star and beamed it to hundreds of worlds across 3 sectors. The system was incredibly complex. It required constant adjustments to account for solar flares, magnetic field fluctuations, and the gravitational effects of passing asteroids. The alien engineers who had taken over the project were brilliant. But they had always followed procedures written by humans. They had never learned to think like engineers. The first power fluctuation was minor, a brief dip in energy output that lasted only a few seconds, but it was a sign that something was wrong. Somewhere in the vast network of collectors and transmitters, Kyung-ho had built monitoring systems that could detect these fluctuations and trace them to their source. But the systems required human intuition to interpret the data. Chief engineer Velkara of the Proxima Centauri Power Authority was a Zephyrian crystal being with an IQ that measured in the thousands. He could perform calculations that would take human computers hours to complete, but when he looked at the monitoring data, he saw only numbers. He could not see the patterns that would have been obvious to a human engineer. The fluctuations continued getting worse each day. Power outages began affecting critical systems on dozens of worlds. Hospitals lost electricity. In the middle of surgeries, life support systems failed on space stations. Cities went dark as the power grid collapsed. Volcara tried everything he could think of. He brought in the best engineers from every species in the council. They analyzed the data, ran computer simulations, and tested thousands of theoretical solutions, but nothing worked. The fluctuations continued, and the power output dropped every day. Finally, in desperation, Velkara sent a message to Earth. "We need engineer Kyung-ho. Seo," he wrote, "we will pay any amount of money. We will give him any position he wants. We just need someone who understands the system." Reply came back within hours. Engineer Seo is retired and has no interest in galactic affairs. However, he has authorized us to send you the complete technical specifications for the Dusin Ring system. Good luck. Vara stared at the massive file of technical data. It contained millions of pages of blueprints, calculations, and procedures, everything needed to understand how the system worked, but it did not contain the one thing he needed most: the experience and intuition that came from actually building and maintaining the system. The humanitarian crisis grew worse every day. Refugee ships fled from worlds where the infrastructure was collapsing. The great council species that had once been proud galactic powers were fragmenting into smaller nations that could barely feed their own people. The Valkyrie hegemony, which had controlled 50 worlds just 3 months ago, was now divided into dozens of feuding city-states. Each group claimed to be the legitimate government, and they spent more time fighting each other than trying to solve their problems. The Altarian Republic had split into 3 separate nations. The Northern Alliance claimed the industrial worlds. The Southern Federation controlled the agricultural planets. The Central Authority held the capital, but had no real power outside the home system. Ancient hatreds that had been kept in check by human diplomacy exploded into violence. The Korthax remembered that the Zephyrians had once enslaved their ancestors. The Verdani recalled genocidal wars from 1,000 years ago. Species that had worked together peacefully for decades began to see each other as enemies. The most frightening development was happening at the edge of known space. Long-range sensors had detected movement in the deep dark, the region beyond the galactic rim where ancient horrors were said to sleep. The destroyer swarm had been quiet for 3 centuries, but now the monitoring stations were picking up signals that suggested something massive was stirring. Admiral Sangmin Ko, who had commanded the Deep Space Early Warning Network, received classified reports at his retirement home on Ganymede. The data was fragmentary, but the pattern was clear. Something was coming, and it was bigger than anything the galaxy had faced in recorded history. The destroyer swarm had last emerged during the Great War, when the galaxy was united under strong leadership. Human tactical genius and alien technology had barely been enough to drive them back into the void. Now the galaxy was weak, divided, and leaderless. If the swarm emerged again, there might be no one left to stop them. Admiral Ko looked at the data and felt a chill of fear. He had fought the swarm before. He knew what they were capable of, but he also knew that the current council forces would be swept aside like leaves in a hurricane. He considered sending a warning to the council, but then he remembered the last meeting he had attended. A Valkyrie admiral had accused humans of being warmongers who saw enemies everywhere. The council had voted to reduce funding for deep space monitoring because they believed the destroyer threat was just human paranoia. Admiral Ko deleted the message he had been writing. The galaxy had made its choice. It wanted to be free of human warnings, human preparations, and human protection. Now it would face The consequences alone my systems were breaking down faster than anyone had imagined. The careful balance that had kept galactic civilization stable was gone without human engineers to maintain the emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted for 3 days and nights. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered in the Great Chamber where just 4 months ago they had insulted and dismissed humanity. Now they faced empty seats. Where human ambassadors had once sat, and the silence felt like an accusation council. Prime Zexthera stood at the central podium, his 4 arms gesturing dramatically as he spoke to the assembled delegates. "The situation is clear," he said. "We must swallow our pride and ask the humans to return. They were valuable partners, and we may have been too hasty in our criticism." A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber, but it was not enthusiastic. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, remembering their own harsh words about human aggression and unpredictability. The Altarian delegates stood up. "What makes you think they will listen to us?" they asked. "We spent months telling them they were dangerous and untrustworthy. Why would they want to come back?" Council Prime Zexthera had prepared for this question. "We will offer them generous compensation," he said. "New territories, voting rights on the High Council itself, massive payments for their services. They are a practical species. They will see the benefits of renewed cooperation." But even as he spoke, Zexthera knew it was not that simple. The humans had not left because of money or territory. They had left because they were tired of being treated like servants instead of partners. The question was whether the Council could convince them that things would be different this time. The first diplomatic mission to Earth was led by Ambassador Valkanian of the Zephyrian Republic. He was chosen because he had maintained better relations with humans than most Council members. His ship, the Crystal Harmony, approached the Sol system with a small escort fleet broadcasting peaceful intentions on all frequencies. The human response was polite but firm. Ambassador Valkanian was invited to meet with representatives of the Terran government on Luna. The meeting was held in a sterile conference room with no decorations or symbols of state, just a simple table and chairs, and 2 very different species trying to find common ground. Foreign Secretary Hanwil Park represented Earth. She was the sister of the famous Captain Sora Park, who had started the human exodus, but she had chosen diplomacy over the military. Her manner was courteous but distant. Ambassador Valkanian, "I appreciate you coming all this way," she said, "but I should tell you immediately that Earth policy on this matter is final. We are no longer interested in galactic affairs." "But surely," Valkanian said, "you can see that the galaxy is suffering without human participation. Entire worlds are dying. Trade has collapsed. Wars are breaking out everywhere. Don't you feel any responsibility for this crisis?" Secretary Park was quiet for a moment. She had seen the same reports that everyone else had. The humanitarian disaster was getting worse every day, but she also remembered 50 years of council meetings where human concerns were dismissed and human sacrifices were taken for granted. "We feel great sadness for the suffering," she said finally, "but the council made it very clear that they did not want human involvement in important decisions. They called us too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted. Now they have the galaxy. They wanted a galaxy without human interference." Vulcanian leaned forward desperately. "We were wrong," he said. "We made mistakes in our judgment, but surely you can forgive past errors." "The stakes are too high for pride." Secretary Park stood up, indicating that the meeting was over. "We offered our friendship for 50 years," she said. "We shared our technology, fought your wars, saved your worlds, protected your trade routes. In return, we were treated like hired muscle, useful when you needed us, embarrassing when you didn't. Now you want us back because you realize you can't manage without us." The ambassador tried one more time. "We are prepared to offer substantial compensation, new colonies, voting rights on the High Council, massive payments for human services. Thank you for your generous offers," Secretary Park said, "but we are no longer interested in being the galaxy's hired problem solvers. We have our own civilization to build, our own future to secure. Please respect our decision." Ambassador Valkanian returned to Council space empty-handed. His report to the Council was brief and devastating. The humans were not interested in negotiation. They seemed to view the galactic crisis as a natural consequence of Council policies. They felt no obligation to fix problems. They had not created some Council Members suggested harsher measures. Surely the humans could be pressured into cooperation. They might be advanced, but they were just one species against hundreds. The combined fleets of the galaxy could force them to reconsider. This idea was explored. Briefly but quietly abandoned intelligence reports revealed what the humans had been building during their decades in space. The Sol system was not just defended, it was a fortress. Earth was surrounded by orbital weapons platforms that made Council technology look primitive. The asteroid belt had been turned into a minefield. The outer planets bristled with defensive systems. More importantly, the humans had been preparing for this day. They had stockpiled resources, developed new technologies, created backup systems for everything they might need. Earth could survive alone for centuries if necessary. They had learned the lesson that other species had refused to accept. Never depend on others for your survival. Counselor Vextha, who had started the crisis with his insulting speech, tried a different approach. He hired mercenaries to attack human shipping, hoping to draw Earth back into galactic affairs. If humans were being attacked, they would have to respond. They were too honorable to ignore calls for help. The mercenary fleet consisted of 50 ships, crewed by the most desperate and dangerous criminals in the galaxy. They were promised enormous rewards for provoking a human response. They attacked a human cargo convoy near the edge of Sol system, expecting an easy victory against civilian ships. The convoy consisted of 3 cargo vessels and a single escort. The mercenaries outnumbered them 15-1. It should have been a massacre. Instead, the mercenaries found themselves facing technology they had never seen before. The human escort ship moved like nothing they had ever encountered. Its weapons cut through their shields like paper. The battle lasted 6 minutes. When it was over, 47 mercenary ships were drifting wreckage. The remaining 3 fled toward Council space, carrying tales of impossible human weapons and tactics. A week later, Counselor Vextha's personal yacht was found drifting empty near Titan. There was no sign of violence, no indication of how the crew had vanished, just a simple note attached to the captain's chair. We said, "Leave us alone." The message was clear. The humans were not helpless victims waiting to be rescued. They were an advanced military power that preferred isolation, but would defend themselves if threatened. The galaxy could choose to respect their wishes or face the consequences. Meanwhile, the collapse accelerated without human mediation. The Great Council species continued to fragment. The Velkari hegemony was now 17 different nations. The Altarian Republic had become 6 separate states. The smaller species were forming desperate alliances that changed weekly as the political situation shifted. The economic situation grew worse as trade networks collapsed. Insurance companies refused to cover ships traveling through pirate-controlled space. The cost of transporting goods increased by 1,000%. Worlds that had prospered for centuries found themselves isolated and struggling. The military situation was catastrophic. Border wars erupted between former allies as old grievances surfaced. Pirate fleets grew bold, attacking Council worlds directly. The outer colonies were abandoned as governments focused on protecting their core territories. Most frightening of all, the deep space monitoring stations continued to report strange signals from beyond the galactic rim. The destroyer swarm was definitely moving. Something massive was approaching, and the divided galaxy had no unified defense. Admiral Sangmin Ko, who had once commanded the unified galactic fleet, watched from his garden on Ganymede as the civilization he had spent his life protecting tore itself apart. He received desperate messages from former colleagues begging for advice, offering payments, pleading for help. But Admiral Ko had learned the same lesson as every other human who had served the galaxy. Gratitude was temporary, but contempt was forever. The aliens had made their choice when they decided that human protection was no longer needed. Now they would face the future alone. The desperate measures had failed. The humans were not coming back. The galaxy would have to find its own way forward, but with each passing day it became more obvious that the way forward might not exist at all. The end was approaching, and there was no one left to stop it. 1 year had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy was barely recognizable. What had once been a proud confederation of 1,000 worlds was now a scattered collection of failed states, pirate kingdoms, and dying colonies. The great trade networks that had connected civilizations across the stars had collapsed into isolated pockets of desperate survivors. Drg1 Lee worked in her small medical clinic on Luna, treating miners and asteroid workers who brought her news from across the solar system. She had once been the head of the Galactic Medical Corps, coordinating health services for 300 worlds, commanding hospitals that could treat any disease known to science. Now she prescribed medicine for space sickness and set broken bones, but she tried not to think about what was happening beyond Earth's borders. The reports that filtered through the communication networks painted a picture of complete collapse. The plague that she had warned the Council about was spreading unchecked through the former Council worlds. Her old colleagues had ignored her recommendations about quarantine procedures. They had called her protocols too strict, too paranoid, too typically human. In their overcautiousness, millions were dead and entire star systems were under medical quarantine. The aliens had the knowledge to treat the disease, but they did not have the infrastructure to distribute medicine or the organizational skills to coordinate a galaxy-wide response. They had relied on human logistics for so long that they had forgotten how to manage large-scale operations. Captain Sora Park commanded a peaceful cargo route between Mars and Jupiter, carrying supplies to the mining stations and research outposts that kept the Sol system running. It was quiet work compared to her old job protecting alien worlds from pirates and raiders. She liked the quiets. Her ship's communication array picked up distress signals from Council space automated emergency beacons crying out for help, ships broadcasting mayday calls that would never be answered, worlds begging anyone to respond to their crisis. But